Hi friends, continuing to the chapter The Namesake. Goggle feeding began. It's all just a touch, a gesture. No one except that the boy to eat anything more than a grain of rice here, a drop of dal there. It is all meant to introduce him to a lifetime of conception, a meal to an inaugurate the ten of thousands as the proceeding begin. A conch shell is repeatedly tapped and passed around, but no one in the room is able to get into emit a sound. Blades of grass and a Pradeep's slim, steady flame are held to the goggle's head. The child is entered, doesn't squirm or turn away, open his mouth obediently for each and every course. He takes his page 3 times. Azima's eyes fill with tears as Goggle's mouth eagerly invites the spoon. She can't help wishing her own brother were here to feed him, her own parents to bless him with their hands on his head. And then the grand finally, the moment they have all have been waiting for, to predict his future's path in the life. Goggle is offered a plate holding a clump of an cold Cambridge soil dug up from the backyard, a ball pen point and a dollar bill to see if he will be a landlord, scholar, or a businessman. Most children will grab at once them, sometimes all of them, but Goggle touched nothing. He shows no interest in the plate, instead, turning away, briefly burying his face in his honorary uncle's shoulder. Put the money in his hand. Someone in the group calls out. An American boy must be rich. No, his father protect. The pen. Goggle, take the pen. Goggle regards the plate doubtfully. Dozens of dark heads over expectantly. Material of the Punjabi pajama said to begin to scratch his skin. Go on, Goggle, take something. Dilip Nandi say, drawing the plate close. Goggle frowns and his lower lip trembles. Only then, forced at 6 months to confirm his destiny, does he begin to cry. Another August, Goggle is one, grabbing, walking a little, repeating words in 2 languages. He called his mother Ma, his father Baba. If a person in the room says Goggle, he turns his head and smiles. He sleeps through the night and between the noon 3 each day. He has 7 teeth. He constantly attempts to put the tiniest scrap of a paper and lint and whatever else he finds on the floor into his mouth. Ashoka and Azima are planning this trip to Calcutta in December, during Ashok's winter break. The upcoming journey inspired them to try to come up with a good name for Goggle, so they can submit his passport applications. They turn to their Bengali friends for suggestion. Long evening are devoted to considering this name or that, but nothing appeals to them. By then, they have given up on the letter from Azima's grandmother. They have given up on her grandmother's remembering the name of Azima. Still, there is a time. The trip to the Calcutta is 4 months away. Azima regrets that they can't go earlier in time for Durga Puja, but it will be years before Ashoka is eligible for a sabbatical, and 3 weeks in December is all they can manage. It is a life like going home a few months after your Christmas. Azima explains to Judy one day over the clothes line. Judy replies that she and Ireland are Buddhist. At the breakneck speed, Azima knits sweater vest for her father, her father-in-law, her brother, her 3 favorite uncles. They are all the same. V-necked, pink green yak, knit 5 per 2 on numbers 9 needle. The expectation is her father's done is a double-seated stitch with the 2 thick cables and the button down the front. He prefers the cardigans to pullovers, and she remembers to put in the pocket for the deck of a card he always carries with him, to play a patience at a moment's choice. In addition to the sweater, she buys him a 3 stable hand paint brushes from the hardwood groups sized he requested by mail. Though they are widely expensive, more so than anything else she even bought in America. Ashoka says nothing when sees the bill. One day Azima goes shopping in the downtown Boston, spending hours in the basement of Jordan Marsh as she pushes Gol in her stroller, spending every last penny. She buys mismatched teaspoons, fursal pillowcases, colored candles, soaps on ropes. In a drugstore, she buys a Timex watch for her father-in-law, big pen for her cousins, embroidery threads and the thimbles for her mother and her aunt. On the train home, she is exhilarated, exhausted, nervous with anticipation of the trip. The train is covered, and at the first she stands, struggling to hang on to all the bags and the strollers and the overhead strap, until a young girl asks if she would like to sit down. Azima thanks her, sinking gratefully into the seat, pushing the bags protectively behind her legs. She is tempted to sleep as Goggle does. She leans her head against the window and closes her eyes and thinks of the home. She pictured the black iron bars in the window of her parents' flat, and Goggle is in American boy clothes and the diapers playing beneath the ceiling fan on her parents' 4-poster bed. She pictures her father missing a tooth, lost after a recent fall, her mother has written on the stairs. She tries to imagine how it will feel when her grandmother doesn't recognize her. When she opens her eyes, she sees that the train is standing still. The doors open at her stop. She leaps up, her heart raking. "Excuse me, please," she says, pushing the stroller and herself through the tightly packed bodies. "Ma'am," someone says as she struggled past, about to step on to the platform. "Your things." The doors of the subway clump shut as she realizes her mistake, and the train rolls slowly away. She stands there watching until the rear car disappears into the tunnel, until she and Goggle are the only people remaining on the platform. She pushes the stroller back down Massachusetts Avenue, weeping freely, knowing that she can't possibly afford to go back and buy it all again. For the rest of the afternoon, she is furious with herself, humiliating at the protest of arriving in Calcutta empty-handed apart from the sweaters and the paint brushes. But when Ashok comes home, he calls the MBTA lost and found. The following days, the bags are returned, not a teaspoon missing. Somehow, this small miracle causes Azima to feel connected to the Cambridge in a way she had not previously thought possible. Afflicted with its expectation as well as its role. She has a story to tell at her dinner parties. Friends listen amazed at her luck. Only in this country, Mayanadi says. One night, not long after, they are fast asleep when the telephone rings. The sound rouses them instantly, their hearts hammering as if from the same frightening dream. Azima knows even before Ashok answers that it is called from India. A few months ago, her family has asked in a letter for the phone number in Cambridge, and she had sent it recurrently in her reply, aware that it would only be a way for a bad news to reach her. As Ashok sits up and takes the receiver, answering in a weary, weakened voice, Azima prepares herself. She puts down the crib, riling to comfort Gogol, who has begun staring at the result of an telephone's ring, and reviews the facts in her head. Her grandmother is in her 80s, bedridden, all but senile, unable to eat or talk. The last few months of her life, according to her parents' most recent letters, have been painful for her mothers, for those who know her. It was no way to live. She pictures her mother saying all this gently into the next door's neighbor. Phone. Standing in the neighbor's sitting room, Azima prepares herself for the news, to accept the fact that the Gogol will not never meet his grandmother, the giver of his lost name. The room is unpleasant cold. She picks up the Gogol and gets back into the bed under the blanket. She presses the baby to her body for the strength, put him to her breast. She thinks of an cream-colored cardigan bought with her grandmother in the mind. Sitting in a shopping bag in the closet, she hears Ashok speaking, saying soberly, bit loudly enough so that she fears he will wake Alan and Judy upstairs. Yes, all right, I see. Don't worry, yes, I will. For a while, he is silent, listening. They want to talk to you, he says to Azima, briefly putting a hand to her shoulders. In the dark, he hands her the phone, and after a moment's hesitation, he gets out of the bed. She takes the phone in the order to hear the news for herself, to console her mother. She can't help but wonder how will console her the day her own mother dies. If that the news will also come to her in this way, in the middle of the night, resting her for the dreams. In spite of her dread, she feels a thrill. This will be the first time she heard her mother's voice in nearly 3 years. The first time since her departure from Dum Dum Airport that she will be called Mono. Only it isn't her mother but her brother Rana on the other end. His voice sounds small, threatening into a wire, barely recognizable through the holes of the receiver. Zima's first question is what time it is there. She has to repeat the questions 3 times, shouting in order to be heard. Rana tells her it is lunchtime. Are you still planning to visit in December? He asks. She feels her chest ache, moved after all this time to hear her brother call her Didi, his older sister, a term He alone in the world is enlightened to use. At the same time, she hears a water running in the Cambridge kitchen, her husband opening a cupboard for a glass. Of course, we are coming. She says, unsettled when she hears her echo saying in faintly, less conveniently once again, how is Didi? Has anything else happened to her? Still alive, Rana says, but still the same. Azima rests back on her pillow, limps with relief. She would see her grandmother, after all, even if for one last time. She kissed Goggle on the top of his head, pressed her cheek to this. Thank goodness. Put Ma on, she says, crossing her ankles. Let me talk to her. She is not at the home now, Rana says after a static filled pause. And Baba, a patch of a silence follow before his voice returned. Not here. Oh, she remember the time difference. Her father must be at the work already at the Desh offices, her mother at the market, a burlap bag in hand, buying vegetable and fish. How is little Goggle? Rana asked her. Does he only speak English? She laughs. He doesn't speak much of anything at the moment. She begins to tell Rana that she is teaching Goggle to say Dida and Dadu and Mamu, to recognize his grandparents and his uncle from the photographs. But another burst of static, longer this time, quiets in her mid sentence. Rana, can you hear me? I can hear you, Didi, Rana says, his voice groaning fainter. Can't hear. Let speak later. Yes, she says, later. See you soon, very soon. Write to me. She puts down the phone, invigorated by the sound of her brother's voice. An instant later, she is confused and somewhat irritated. Why had he gone to the trouble of calling, only to ask an obvious question? Why call while both of her parents are out? Ashok returns from the kitchen, a glass of water in his hand. He sets down the water and switches on the small lamp by the side of the bed. I am awake, Ashok says, though his voice is still small from fatigue. Me too. What about Goggle? Asleep again. She gets up and puts him back in the crib, drawing the blanket to his shoulder, then returns to the bed, shivering. I don't understand it, she says, shaking her head at the rumpled sheet. Why did Rana go to the trouble of calling just now? It is so expensive. It doesn't make sense. She turns to look at Ashok. Why did he say to you exactly? Ashok shakes his head from the side to the side, his profile lowered. He told you something you're not telling me. Tell me, what did he say? He continues to shake his head, and then he reached across her side of the bed and pressed her hand so tightly that it is slightly painful. He presses her to the bed, lying on the top of her, his face to one side, his body suddenly trembling. He holds her this way for so long that she begins to wonder if he is going to turn off the light and carries her. Instead, he tells her what Rana told him a few minutes ago. What Rana couldn't bear to tell his sister over the phone himself, that her father died yesterday evening of a heart attack, playing patient on his bed. They leave for India 6 days later, 6 weeks before they had planned. Alan and Judy awaking the next morning to Azima's sob. Then hearing the news from Ashok, leaves a vase filled with the flowers by the door. In those 6 days, there is no time to think of a good name for Goggle. They get an express passport with Goggle Ganguly typed across the United States of America seal. Ashok singing on his son's behalf. The day before leaving, Azima puts Google in her stroller, puts the sweater she would knight for her father and the paintbrushes in a shopping bag, and walks to the Harvard Square to the subway station. "Excuse me," she asks a gentleman on the street. "I must get on the train." The man helped her carry down the stroller, and Azima waits on the platform. When the train comes, she heads immediately back to the central square. This time she is wide awake. There are only a half a dozen people in the car, their faces hidden behind the globe, or looking down at the paperback books, or staring straight through her at nothing. As the train slows to a halt, she stands, ready to disembark. She doesn't turn back to look at the shopping bag left purposely beneath her seat. Hey, the Indian lady forgot her stuff. She hears as the door shut. As the train pulls away, she hears a fist pounding on the glass, but she keeps walking, pushing Goggle along the platform. The following evening, they board a Pan Am flight to London, where after a 5 hours layover, they will board a second flight to Calcutta via Tehran and Bombay. On the runway in the Boston, her seat belt buckled, Azima looked at her watch and calculated the Indian time on her fingers. But this time, no image of her family comes to the mind. She refuses to picture what she shall seen enough. Her mother's word millions erased from her part. Her brother's thick hair shaved from his head is mourning. The wheel began to move, causing the enormous metal wings to flap gently up and down. Azima looked at Ashok, who is double checking and make sure this passport and green cards are in order. She watches him adjust his watch in anticipation of their arrival. The pale silver hangs scissoring into the place. "I don't want to go," she says, turning towards the dark oval window. "I don't want to see them. I can't." Ashok put his hand over her as the plane begins to gather speed. And then Boston tilts away and they ascend effortlessly over a blackened Atlantic. The wheel retracts and the cabin shakes as they struggle upwards through the first layer of the clouds. Though Gogol's ears have been stuffed with the cotton, he screams nevertheless in the arms of his grieving mother as they climb farther still, as he flies for the first time in his life across the world. In 1971, Ganguly have moved to a university town outside Boston. As far as they know, they are the only Bengali residents. The town has an historic district, a brief streak of an colonial architecture visited by the tourist on summer weekends. That is a white steepled congregational church, a stone courthouse with an adjoining jail, a cup-locked public library, a wooden well from which the Paul River is rumored to have drunk. In winter, tappers burn in the windows of the home after dark. Ashok have been hired as an assistant professor of electrical engineering at the university. In exchange for the teaching 5 classes, he earns $16,000 a year. He is given his own office with his name etched on a strip of an black plastic by the door. He shares along with the other members of his department the service of an elderly security named Mrs. John, who often puts a plate of an homemade Madonna bread by the coffee percolator in the staff room. Ashok suspects that Mr. Jones, whose husband used to teach in the English department until his death, is about his own mother's age. Mrs. Jones led a life that Ashok's mother would consider humiliating, eating alone, driving herself to the work in snow and sleet, seeing her children and the grandchildren at most 3 or 5 times a year. The job is everything Ashoks have ever dreamed of. He has always hoped to teach in an university rather than work for a corporation. What a thrill, he thinks, to stand lecturing before a room full of an American students. What a sense of an acknowledgement it gives him to see him name printed under faculty in the university directory. What joy each time Mrs. Jones says him, "Professor Ganguly, your wife is on phone." From his fourth floor office, he has an sweeping view of an quadrangle surrounded by wine-covered brick buildings, and on a pleasant day, he takes his lunch on the bench, listening to the melody of the bells chiming from the campus clock tower. On Fridays, after he had taught his last class, he visits the library to read an international newspaper on long wooden poles. He reads about US planes bombing supply routes in Cambodia. Naxalites began murder on the streets of Calcutta, India, and the Pakistan going to war. All times he wanders up to the library's sun-filled, unpopulated top floor, where all the literatures is shelved. He browses in the aisles, gravitating most often towards his beloved Russians, where he is partially confirmed each time by his son's name stamped in the golden letter on the spines of a row of red and green and blue hardbound books. For Azima, migration to the suburbs feels more drastic, more distracting than the move from Calcutta to Cambridge had been. She wishes Ashok had accepted the position at the Northeastern so that they could have stayed in the city. She is stunned that in this town there are no sidewalks to speak of, no street lights, no public transportations, no stores for a mile at the time. She has no interest in learning how to drive the car. The new Toyota Corolla it is now necessary for them to own. Though no longer pregnant, she continued at a time to mix the rice crisps and the peanut and the onion in the bowl. For being a foreigner, Azima is being to realize is a sort of an lifelong pregnancy, a perpetual weight, a constant burden, a continuous feeling out of a sort. It is an ongoing responsibility, a pathos in what had once been ordinary life, only to discover that the previous life has vanished, replaced by something more complicated and demanding. Like pregnancy, being a foreigner, Azima believes is something that eclipses the same curiosity from the stranger, the same combination of a pity and respect. Her forays out of an apartment while her husband is at the work or limited to the university within which they live, and to the historic district that flanks the campus on one edge. She wanders around with the goggle, letting him run across the quadrangle or sitting with him on a rainy days to watch the television in the student lounge. Once a week, she makes a 30 samosas to all set to International Coffee House for 25 cents each. Next to the lines are square, baked by Mrs. Edzold and baklava by Mr. Casolis. On Friday, she takes Gogol to the public library for children's story hour. After he turned 4, she drops him off and fetch him from the university run nursery school 3 mornings a week. For that hours that Gogol is at nursery school, finger painting and learning the English alphabets, Azima is despondent and accumulated all over again to being her own. She misses her son's habit of always holding on to the free end of her sari as they walk together. She misses the sound of his sulky, high-pitched little boy voice telling her that he is hungry or tired or need to go to the bathroom. To avoid being alone at the home, she sits in the reading room of the public library in a crackled leather armchair, writing letters to her mother or reading magazines or one of her Bengali books from the home. The room is cheerful, filled with light, with a tomato colored carpet on the floor and people reading the paper around a big round wooden table with frothy thighs or cattails arranged at the center. When she misses Goggles especially, he wanders into the children's room. There, pinned to a bulletin board, is a picture of him in the profile, sitting cross-legged on a cushion during the story hours, listening to the children's librarian, Mrs. Aiken, reading The Cat in the Hat. After 2 years in an overheaded university subsidized apartment, Azima and Ashok are ready to purchase a home. In the evening, after dinner, they set out in their car, Gogol in the back seat, to look at the house for sale. They do not look in the historic district where the chairman of the Ashok's department lives, in an 18th century mansion to which he and Azima and Gogol are invited once a year for Boxing Day tea. Instead, they look on ordinary roads where plastic wading pools and the baseball bats are left out of the lawns. All the house belonging to Americans, shoes are worn inside. Trays of a cat litters are placed in the kitchens. Dog barks and jumps when Azima and Ashok ring the bell. They learn the names of different architectural style: cave, salt box, raised ranch, Gary Sins. In the end, they decided on a single 2-story colonial in a recently built development, a house previously occupied by no one, erected on a quarter-acre of land. This is a small patch of an America to which they lay claim. Gogol accompanies his parents to the bank, sits awaiting as they sign the endless papers. The mortgage is approved and the move is scheduled for the spring. Ashok and Azima are amazed when moving by the U-Haul to the new house to discover how much they possess. Each of them have come to America with a single suitcase, a few weeks worth of clothes. Now there are enough old issues of the Globe stacked in the corners of the apartment to wrap all their plates and glasses. They all the whole year of Time magazine to toss out. The walls of a new houses are painted, the driveway sealed with the pitch, the shingles and the sun deck weatherproofed and stained. Ashok takes the photograph of every room, Gogol standing somewhere in the frame, to send to the relatives in India. There are pictures of Goggles opening up the refrigerators, pretending to talk on the phone. He is a sturdily built child with full cheeks but already pensive features. When he poses for the camera, he has to be coaxed into the smile. The house is 15 minutes from the nearest supermarket, 40 minutes from the mall. The address is 67 Pembertarian Road. The neighbors are the Johnson, the Mertens, the Aspers, the Hills. There are 4 modest bedroom, 1.5 bathroom, 7-foot ceiling and 1 car garage. In the living room is a brick fireplace and a bay window overlook the ward. In the kitchen there are a matching yellow appliances, a lazy Susan linoleum made to look like the tiles. A water cooler by Azima's father of a caravan of camels in a desert in Rajasthan is framed at the local print shop and hangs on the living room wall. Goggle has a room of his own, a bed with a built-in drawer, it is in the base. Metal shelves that holds Tinger Troy's The Lincoln's Law, a Viewmaster and a sketch. Most of Goggle's toys come from yard sales, as does most of the furniture and the curtains and the toasters and a set of pots and pans. At first, Azima is reluctant to introduce such items into her home. Ashamed to that thought of buying what had originally belonged to the strangers, American strangers at that. But Ashok's point out even his chairman's shops and yard sale, that in spite of living in a mansion, an American is not about wearing a pair of an second-hand pants bought for 50 cents. When they first move into the house, the grounds have yet to be landscaped. No trees grows on the property, no shrubs flank the front door so that the cement of the foundation is clearly visible to the eyes. And so far, the first few months, 4-year-old Goggle plays on an uneven, dirt-covered yard littered with stone and sticks, soiling his sneakers, leaving footprints in his path. It is among his earliest memories. For the rest of his life, he will remember that cold, overcast spring, digging in the dirt, collecting the rocks, discovering black and yellow salamanders beneath an overturned slab of a slate. He will remember the sound of the other children in the neighborhood, laughing and plodding their big wheel down the road. He will remember the warm, big summer day when the topsoil was poured from the back of a truck, and stepping on to the sun deck a few weeks later with both of his parents to see thin blades of a grass emerge from the black lawn. In the beginning, in the evenings, his family goes for the drives, exploring their new environs, bit by bit. The neglected dirt lanes, the shaded back roads, the farm where one could pick pumpkins in autumn and buy berries sold in the green cardboard boxes in July. The back seat of the car is sheeted with the plastic, the ashtrays on the door still steel. They drive until it's go dark, without a destination in the mind, past hidden ponds and the grey yards, culls de sac and the dead ends. Sometimes they drive out of the town altogether to one end of the beaches along the north shore. Even in summer, they never go to the swim or to the turn brown beneath the sun. Instead, they go to the dressed in their ordinary clothes. By the time they arrive, the tickets collector's booth is empty, the crowd gone. There is only a handful of cars in the parking lot, and the only other visitors are the people walking their dogs or watching the sunset or dragging metal detector through the sand. Together, as the Gangulis drive, they anticipate the moment the thin blue line of the ocean will come into the view. On the beach, Gogol collects the rocks, dig tunnels in the sand. He and his father wander the barefoot, their pants leg rolled halfway up their calves. He watches his father raise in a kite within the minutes into the wind, so high that the Gogol must tip his head back in order to see. A ripple speak against the sky. Snowy gull hover with the wing spread low enough to touch. The wind whips around this ear, turning the face cold. Gogol trots in and out of the ocean, making faint temporarily the footprints, soaking his roll-up cuff. His mother cries out, laughing, and she lifts her sari in the few inches about her ankles, her slippers in one hand and the places her feet in foaming the ice-cold water. She reaches out to Gogol, taking his hand. Not so far, she tells him. The waves retreat, gathering the force, the soft, dark sand to shift away instantly beneath their feet, causing them to lose their balance. I'm falling, it's putting me in, she always says. The August that the Gogol turns 5, Azima discovered she is pregnant again. In the morning, she forces herself to eat a slice of a toast, only because Ashok makes it for her and washes her while she chews into his bed. Her head constantly spins. She spent her days lying down. A pink plastic waste paper basket by her side and the shades drawn. Her mouth and the teeth coated with the taste of a metal. She watches the prince is right and the guiding light and the 1 lakh pyramid. On the television, Ashok moves inform the living room to her side of a bed. Staggering out to the kitchen at the lunchtime to prepare a peanut butter and a jelly sandwich for Gogol. She is revolted by the order of the fridge, convicated that the content of her vegetables drawers has been replaced with garbage. That means it is rotting on the shelves. Sometimes Gogol lies beside her in their parents' bedroom, reading a pictures book or coloring with the crayons. You are going to be an older brother, she tells him one day. There I will be someone's to call you Dada. Won't that be exciting? Sometimes, if she is feeling energetic, she asked Gogol to go and get a photo album, and together they look at the pictures of Gogol's grandparents and his uncle and aunts and the cousins, of whom, in the spite of his love, one visit to Calcutta. He has no memory. She teases him to memorize a 4-line children's poem by the Tagore and the names of the deities adorning the 10-handed goddesses Durga during the puja. Saraswati with her swan and Kartik with his peacock to her left, Lakshmi with her owl and Ganesh with his mouse to her right. Every afternoon, Azima sleeps, but before nodding off, she switches the television to the channel 2 and tells Gogol to watch on Summersea Street and the Electric Company in order to keep up with the English, he used at nursery school. In the evening, Goggle and his father eat together. Alone, a week's worth of an chicken curry and rice, with his father cooks in two battered Dutch ovens every Sunday. As the food reheats, his father tells Google to shut the bedroom door because his mother cannot tolerate the smell. It is odd to see his father's preparing in the kitchen, standing in his mother's place at the stove. When they sit down at the table, the sound of his parents' conversation is missing, as is the sound of the television in the living room playing the news. His father eats with his head bent over his plate, flipping through the last issue of Times, occasionally glancing at the Goggle to make sure he is eating as well. Though his father remembers to mix up the rice and the curry for the Googles beforehand, he doesn't bother to shape it into an individual balls the way his mother does, lining them around his plates like the number on an clock face. Goggle has already been taught to eat on his own with his fingers, not to let the food stain the skin on his palm. He had learned to suck the marrow from the lamb, to extract the bone from the fish. But without his mother at the table, he does not feel like eating. He keeps wishing everything that she should emerge from the bedroom and sit between him and his father, filling the air with her sari and cardan smell. He grows bored of eating the same thing day after the day, and one evening he distractedly pushes the remaining food to the side, with his index finger in the trace of an leftover sauce. He begins to draw on his plate. He plays a tic-tac-toe. Finish, his father says, glancing up from his magazine. Don't play with the food that way. I'm full, Baba. There is still some food on your plate. Baba, I can't. His father's plate is polished clean, the chicken bones newed of catlight and chewed to the pinkish pulp, the bay leaf and the cinnamon stick as good as new. Ashok shakes his head at the Google, disapproving and unyielding. Each day, Ashok is pained by the half-eaten sandwiches people toss into the garbage cans on the campus. Apples abandoned after one or the two bites. Finish it, Goggle. At your age, I ate 9. Because his mother tends to vomit the moment she finds herself in a moving car, she is unable to accompany her husband to take Google. In September of 1973, to his first day of an kindergarten at the town's public elementary school. By the time Google starts, it is already the second week of the school year. But for the past year, Google has been in the bed just like his mother, listless, without appetite, claiming to have a stomach ache, even vomiting one day into his mother's pink waste paper basket. He doesn't want to go to kindergarten. He doesn't want to wear the new clothes his mother has bought him from Sears, hanging on a knob of his dresses, or carry his Charlie's brown lunch bag, or board the yellow school bus that stops at the end of an Pemberton road. The school, unlike the nursery school, is several miles from the house, several miles from the university. On numerous occasions, he has been driven to see the buildings, low, long brick structures with a perfectly flat roof of an flag that flaps at the top of an tall white pole planted on the lawn. There is a reason Goggle doesn't want to go to kindergarten. His parents have told him that at the school, instead of being called Google, he will be called by a new name, a good name, which his parents have finally decided on, just in the time for him to begin his formal education. His name is Nikhil, is artfully connected to the old. Not only it is perfectly respectable Bengali good name, meaning he who is entire in accompanying all, but it is also bears a satisfying resemblance to Nikhil, the first name of an Russian Gogol. Ashok had thought of it recently, staring mindlessly at the Google spines in the library, and he had rushed back to the house to ask her Azima her opinion. He pointed out that it was relatively easy to pronounce, though there was the danger that the Americans obsessed with the abbreviation won't turn it into Nick. She told him that she liked it well enough, though later, alone, she wept, thinking of her grandmother, who had died earlier in the years, and of the letters forever hovering somewhere been in India and America, containing the good names she would have chosen for Gogol. Azima still dreams of the letters at the time, discovering it after all these years in the mailbox of an Pemberton road, opening it up only to find it blank. But Google doesn't want a new name. He can't understand why he has to answer to anything else. Why do you have to have a new name? He asked his parent, tears sprinkling his own eyes. It would be one thing that if his parents were to call him Nikhil too, but they tell him that the new name will be used only one by the teachers and the children at the school. He is afraid to be a Nikhil, someone he doesn't know. Who doesn't know him? His parents tell him that they each have two names, two as do all their Bengali friends in America and all their relatives in Calcutta. It is a part of growing up. They will tell him a part of being a Bengali. They write it for him on a sheet of paper, ask him to copy it over 10 times. Don't worry, his father says. To me and to your mother, you will never be anyone but Google. At the school, Ashok and Google are greeted by the security. Mrs. McNabb, who asked Ashok to fill out a registration form, he provides a copy of an Google's birth certificate and immunization record, which Mr. Nagab puts in the folder along with the registration. This way, Mrs. Nagab says, leading them to the principal office, Candy Labori. The name on the door says that Mrs. Laborius Azores. Ashok that missing the first week of an kindergarten is not a problem, that things have yet to settle down. Mr. Lapidus is a tall, slender woman with a short, blonde hair. She wears a frosted blue eye shadows and a lemon yellow suits. She shakes Ashok's hand and tells him that there are two other American Indian children at this American school. Jaydev Modi in the 3rd grade and Rekha Saxena in the 5th grade. Perhaps Gangulis know them. Ashok tells that Mrs. Lapidus that they do not. She looks at the registration form and smiles kindly at the boy, who has clutched his father's hand. Gogol is dressed in a powder blue pants, red and a white canvas sneakers, a striped turtleneck top. Welcome to the elementary school, Nikhil. I am your principal, Mrs. Lapidus. Gogol looked down at his sneakers. The way the principal pronounces his new name is different from the way his parents says it. The second part of its longer sounded like heel. She bends down so that her face is level with his and extended a hand to his shoulder. Can you tell me how old are you, Nikhil? When the question is repeated and there is still no response, Mrs. Lapidus asks, Mr. Ganguly, does Nichols follow English? Of course he follow. Ashok says, my son is perfectly a bilingual. In order to prove that Gogol knows English, Ashok does something he has never done before and address his son in careful accented English. Go on, Google, he says, patting him on the head. Tell Mrs. Lapidus, how old are you? What was that? Mrs. Lapidus says. I beg your pardon, madam. That name you called him. Something with a G. Oh, that it was. We call him at the home only. But his good name should be Ace. He nods his head firmly, Nikhil. Mrs. Lapidus frowns. I'm afraid I don't understand. Good name, yes. Mrs. Lapidus studied the registration form. She has not had to go through his confusion with the order the other two Indian children. She opened up the folder and examined the immunization record, the birth certificate. There seems to be some confusion, Mr. Ganguly, she says. According to these documents, your son's legal name is Gangul. This is correct. But please allow me to explain that you want us to call him Nikhil. That is correct. Mrs. Lapidus notes. The reason being, that is our wish. I am not sure I will follow you. Mr. Ganguly, do you mean that Nikhil is a middle name or a nickname? Many of the children go by the nicknames here. On this form, there is a space. No, it is not a middle name. Ashok says. He is beginning to lose the patience. He has no middle name, no nickname. The boy's good name, his school name is Nikhil. Mrs. Lapidus pressed her lips together and smiled, but clearly he doesn't respond. Please, Mr. Lapidus, Ashok says. I am a very common for a children to be confused at the first. Please give it some time. I assure you he will grow astonished. He blends down and this time in Bengali, calmly and quietly asks Google to please answer when Mr. Lapidus asks a question. Don't be scared, Gogol. He says, raising his son's chin with his finger. You are a big boy now, no tears. Though Mrs. Lapidus does not understand a word, she listens carefully. Hear that the name again, Gogol. Lightly in a pencil, she writes it down on the refrigeration form. As Ashok over the lunchbox, a wild breaker in the case, it's get cold. He thanks Mrs. Lapidus. Be good, Nikhil, he says in English. And then, after a moment, hesitation, he is gone. When they are alone, Mrs. Lapidus asks, are you happy to entering the elementary school, Google? My parents want me to have another name in the school. And what about you, Google? Do you want to be called by the another name? After a pause, he shakes his head. Is that a no? He nods yes. Then it's settled. Can you write your name on this piece of a paper? Goggles picks up a pencil, grip it tightly, and forms the letters of the only word he had learned thus far to write from the memory, getting the L backwards due to nervous. What beautiful penmanship you have, Mrs. Lapidus says. She tears up the old registration form and asks Mrs. McNabb to type up a new one. Then she takes Gogol by the hand down a carpeted hallway with a painted cement wall. She opens the door and Gogol is introduced to his teacher, Miss Watkins, a woman with hair in the two braids, wearing overall and the clock. Inside the classroom, it is a small universe of the nicknames. Andrew is Andy, Alexander Sandy, William Billy, Elizabeth Lizzie. It is nothing like the schooling Google's parents have known. Fountain pens and the polished black shoes and the notebooks and the good names and sir or madam at the tender age. Here, the only official ritual is plunging elegance the first thing in the morning to the American's flag. For the rest of the day, they sit at an communal round table, drinking the punch and eating the cookies, taking naps on a little orange cushions on the floor. At the end of his first day, he is sent home with a letter to his parents from Mrs. Lapidus, folded and stapled to a string around his neck, explaining that due to their son's performance, he will be known as Gogol at the school. What about the parents' preference? Azima and Ashok wonder, shaking their heads, but since neither of them feels comfortable pressing the issue, they have no choice but to give in. Thank you.